And I'm hoping, Wes, you can talk about your experience with capital. And
sure. Well, thanks a lot, Sean, and thanks for inviting me to the panel. It's really, really great to be here today. And I'll just talk for a few minutes about what we're about at Good Capital and kind of the things that we're doing and plans for a new fund that we're currently working on. Similar to the work that Scott does at RSF, we provide capital to really incredible organizations that are creating impact in the world, like Runa, like Indigenous Designs, but with the difference being that we're primarily equity investors, so we're not really lenders. We provide capital, growth capital to help these kind of organizations really scale up and grow their businesses and try to reach the target populations that they're tackling. And really, at the end of the day, we're supporting sustainable models to creating social and environmental impact in the world. That's been primarily through for-profit models like Indigenous and Runa, but we do have investments in nonprofit organizations with earned revenue streams. So an organization like Root Capital that's supporting fair trade cooperatives throughout the developing world. We have a subordinated loan out to Root Capital, but the other investments that we have through our fund are focused on equity investments. So I'll talk about a couple of those companies. Our biggest investment is in a company called Better World Books. Has anyone ever heard of Better World Books? Oh, great, awesome. So it's just a really great model for sustainable impact that's impacting both sort of social and environmental impact. They've created a very virtuous cycle between selling used books, keeping those used books out of landfills in the U.S., and then using the proceeds through the sale of those books to support global literacy initiatives. So they work with groups like Books for Africa, Room to Read, the World Fund in Latin America, the National Council for Family Literacy in the U.S., and those organizations work with Better World Books to collect used books from college campuses and from libraries, and now in communities as well, and get those books back to the warehouse. They screen them. About 50% of them are eligible to sell online based on their model of selling used books for the last 10 years. The books that they can't sell, they end up either donating or, worst case scenario, recycling. They never throw away a book. And then they sell those books online at betterworldbooks.com, but also through other online sales channels such as Amazon and eBay, and take about 10% of the revenue generated from every book sale, not the profits, but actually the revenue, and send those back to the nonprofit literacy organizations that help them get those books. So the more books the nonprofits can help collect for Better World Books, the more money that they generate for those books. And at the time that we invested in Better World Books' Series A about 4 years ago, we encouraged management to carve out a 5% ownership stake in the company that would work essentially like an option pool for employees that would be allocated to their 4 or 5 top literacy organizations over a period of time. So now here we are, 4 years down the road, and I think about 4 or 5 of those organizations have equity ownership in Better World Books. So they're getting cash on an annual basis, and they're also accruing value through essentially common stock options that they have in the company. So if Better World Books, or when Better World Books has a liquidity event, if they get acquired, or if they go public, or if they do some sort of recapitalization where they bring in new investors and liquidate the earlier investors, the nonprofit organizations are going to have a nice windfall of cash, so long as everything goes to plan and works well, which right now the trajectory has been very positive for Better World Books. So we think a lot about the whole sort of ecosystem and all the stakeholders that are involved with organizations like Better World Books, and how can we sort of maximize the value to the entire ecosystem when we make these investments. We've also, I mentioned Root Capital. We've also invested in 2 other fair trade organic businesses. One of them is called Alter Eco, San Francisco-based company. You may have heard of them. I wish I would have brought some of their chocolate for you today, but it's really incredible. It pairs well with Runa tea. Really, really good dark chocolate if you're a dark chocolate fan. And you might want to be really caffeinated, with your Runa tea. I think they've got an 85% cacao blackout chocolate. a year ago they launched, so they sell chocolate, quinoa, rice, and sugar. And all these products are sourced from fair trade cooperatives throughout the developing world. The founders, travel once a quarter to go visit their cooperatives, and they work very closely with them to help make sure that they're adhering to fair trade principles, that they're getting the additional income, and that's going to good uses in the community. And they do very extent. I mean, they rely on some of the fair trade audits that the other the certifying organizations do, but they also do their own audits. And I had the honor of going down to Bolivia to visit Anapki, which is a quinoa cooperative near the Altiplano in Bolivia, and got to sort of witness how they interact with the cooperatives and the work that they do and the interviews and the data collection to make sure that the amount of money that the farmers are getting paid for the quinoa crop is sort of a sustainable living wage for those workers. But what I wanted to tell you was that they came out with this amazing chocolate bar last year that is it's a puffed quinoa chocolate bar. So if you've had like a Nestle Crunch bar, it's sort of the way better organic fair trade version of that, with no soy lectin and emulsifiers and all the really good stuff. So they've actually puffed the quinoa, they put it into the dark chocolate bar, and it's incredible. Really, really good. So,
Do you have any samples?
Exactly. The dark chocolate. I know, I'm so sorry. I'm salivating over the chocolate bar. I didn't bring any. But go to your nearest Whole Foods, pick up a Rona tea and some dark. It's called the dark quinoa crunch bar, and it's very. I actually saw where they puffed the quinoa, and that was pretty cool. And big giant vats that are heated up to about 700 degrees, essentially like big popcorn poppers, and they're like popping the quinoa. It's really, really cool. And we also invested in Adina for Life, which is a beverage company also based here in San Francisco, started by Greg Steltenpole, who's the founder of Odwalla. So we're all about sort of moving money to good, and we've raised money from mostly individual investors, some small family foundations, people that are really sort of into the idea of impact investing. So we're kind of, I feel like philanthropy has a role in creating impact, government has a role in creating impact, but there's still a gap there that can't be served by either of those in a very effective way. And that's where an organization like GoodCap steps in and has more of a investing model where we're leveraging individuals and foundations and institutionals sort of investment capital and put that money to work to create sustainable impact over a period of time, and then not only get that money back but also get a return on it and provide that back to our investors over sort of a 7-year time period, which is sort of the target of our fund. Since starting Good Capital, we also started the Hub Bay Area, which is based here in San Francisco and over in Soma. I'm sure many of you, how many of you have heard of the Hub? Okay, great. So the Hub is a purpose-driven, collaborative workspace, and it's actually part of a global network of hubs that started in London about 6 years ago, and it's a place-based physical space where people go and work on a daily basis, and you get access to a great sort of open floor space of collaborative work, sort of just working around desks, but it's really about the community that we're creating there. And sort of, the tagline is, it's where change goes to work, and it's just incredible to see the sort of collaboration and the serendipity and the work that happens when you get a bunch of like-minded individuals in the same physical space. So if you get a chance, if you haven't been to the Hub, and if you're in town for a few days, definitely go check it out. We're at 901 Mission Street, 5th and Mission. It's in the Soma district, pretty close to the financial district, right off the Powell BART stop. And then since starting that, we've also launched our own seed stage accelerator program called Hub Ventures, where we're working with very early stage companies, giving them some funding and giving them some access to mentorship and different support over a 12-week sort of intensive period, where we help those organizations kind of get off the ground and get some traction for their business models. And then lastly, we're actually working with Sean and another individual, Tom Hatley, in Asheville around a new model. Are we talking about the name of it yet? I know you had the printouts in the back there. The People Planet Holdings Company, which is essentially going to be sort of the next product coming out of Good Capital in collaboration with Sean and Tom, to really focus on organizations that are investing and working to preserve cultural diversity and ecological biodiversity, starting in tribal nations in the U.S., in the Appalachia area, as well in the Southwest, and then moving out into places like Latin America and eventually Africa. It's a new model that's coming together, but it's sort of in the scope of Good Capital in terms of wanting to leverage sort of investment capital to come in and support these organizations that need the kind of capital that we can provide, sort of beyond grants, beyond loans, but it would be very long-term, patient capital, non-extractive capital that would really stay in the community for a long period of time, and sort of match that up with investors that have a long time horizon on their investment outlook to really support these organizations. And we're looking at a few sectors. We're looking at forestry, we're looking at agriculture, artisanal products, ecotourism, education, and local language preservation. So there's a number of organizations, or a number of sectors that we're looking at right now, and we're really excited about this new model and really looking at ways to leverage capital to preserve cultural and ecological diversity. So I'll leave it at that. Kind of said a lot, but
one of the things we're hearing, we're going to get to some questions from all of you soon, but I think it's really interesting, lending, equity investing, and we know there's an important and essential role for philanthropy that it's played in different ways here. But what I do hear that there's a premise, I think, behind the people that invest to RSF or into the companies like Indigenous Designs and Runa or into Good Capital. There is a premise: can we support systemic, sustainable change with some model that eventually is financially self-sustaining? And I think we're hearing about a broad range of experiences. When we think about the possibility of financially self-sustaining models that become drivers of change, I want to point out that I think the accelerator, what we hear is that it's a continuum. Whether it's accelerators and how do we help people with great ideas develop those ideas further, it sometimes requires grant support for that approach. But I think there's a wide range of approaches if we think about the spectrum of how do we nurture these kind of social enterprise approaches to systemic challenges. And one of the things I wanted to turn to Dr. Elliott and share a little bit more. Runa is a company, a for-profit company, yet chose to create a nonprofit foundation, which you direct out of Ecuador. Can help understand why Runa Foundation? Why do you look to, we presume, philanthropy or government support?
Yeah. Great question. So, like I said, we have both the for-profit and the nonprofit within Runa, and really the role of the for-profit is to create this market, to sell products, and to bring that money back to Indigenous people and also back to the investors. That leaves a huge space open for a lot of work that really can't be funded by the for-profit. And that's part of that is working with Indigenous people to create capacity to have a stronger voice in the supply chain. We're fair trade certified with Fair Trade USA under a new certification system. I assume a lot of you all know about fair trade certification, but one of the differences that we face is that this is a brand new crop. So we really believe in the idea of fair trade, but how do you deal with fair trade for a crop that has no existing market? When generally fair trade steps in and says, okay, we're going to set the minimum price here above the market value. Well, there is no market price of Wayusa. So we're working to create, what is that minimum price? But at the same time, not only is there not a market, so there's no minimum price, there's also not a group of farmers who have 50 years experience growing Wayusa, 50 years experience interacting with that international market. So we're dealing with groups of people who aren't used to that. And because of that, one of the biggest roles of the foundation is to create that capacity amongst Indigenous farmers, and so that they can organize themselves. What we've started is through our fair trade certification, we've created a social premium fund. So part of the for-profit buys Wayusa from Indigenous farmers at a minimum price, and then on top of that gives 15% into this fund that's managed by the Indigenous communities. Now that's I think that's totally makes sense for a for-profit. Okay, here, we'll give you some extra money. But the role of the nonprofit, the role of what I do, I live in Ecuador, and every month I meet with the farmers, is to think about, okay, now you guys have this money, how are you going to spend this money? Generally, and this happens throughout the Amazon, you have indigenous communities, they get a windfall profit from maybe some deal with the government for oil exploration, or for now there's red projects that are entering into communities where communities are getting hundreds of thousands of dollars. Communities that used to have no cash in their economy suddenly have a ton of cash. And what do they usually do? A lot of times they spend it on parties. A lot of times the president will take 60% of it and go to Europe. A lot of times, these are the examples. I mean, and then a huge other thing that people like to build stadiums for soccer or volleyball. But one of our roles is to really sit there and say, okay, how can we really think about, this money is both a blessing and a curse. And that's not part of your history, is to think about how to spend it. So we're there to say, okay, let's plan this out. Let's think about how can we create long-term sustainability, long-term change with that fund. And that's a role of the nonprofit. That's something that the for-profit wouldn't do, and that's not what, buying a tea bag just in and of itself can fund that work. We also are really focused on the research of how to grow white yucca. I mean, agriculture is generally a very subsidized sector, and there's a lot of reasons why. Dealing with the Amazon, you're dealing with a very fragile ecosystem, and a big role of our nonprofit is to figure out how do we grow white yucca in a way that will preserve forest, how do we grow it organically, and how do we grow it so that we can maximize production but without turning it into a monocrop. So we get funds. The nonprofit we mostly work with, we have some private funding from private foundations in the US, and we also get a lot of our funding from governments. We have funding we just got a large grant from the Finnish government. We've also gotten support from the German cooperation, GIZ, and other funding sources. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about what you were saying is this with the books, the Better World books, is thinking about how to carve out a space maybe within the for-profit to have a long-lasting income stream into a nonprofit, if that's what I understand.
Yep.
That I would love to chat with you more, but I think being really creative about thinking about, okay, there is definitely a role for nonprofits in this sector. I don't think that, if we left the whole world to Chevron and Exxon, I don't think that, or to big for-profit, solely profit-driven motives, I don't really think we would have the change. I think there is a role for nonprofits. There's definitely a role for governments. And I think what's really interesting about us is figuring out, well, how does that work together? We're only a 3-year-old company. We're all very young. I'm 29, and I'm the oldest person in the group. And so we're trying to figure this out, and we're trying to really figure out how do we link those two, the for-profit and the nonprofit. And I think it's not totally clear-cut, and I think there's a lot of room for being creative. But I think that in its essence, that we really do believe that one by itself isn't sustainable, and we need to figure out how to use both to create the social change.
Elliot, I know you're on a growth curve, Runa, kind of through rapid growth, but get a sense, how many communities are you working with, and what are your total sales?
Cool. So we just hit 1,600 farmers, which is, again, generally we multiply that by 5 to say that our total beneficiaries are about 7,500 people because of the size of the family. We work in 122 communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon in the Napo province, and we're growing very fast. By the end of this year, we'll probably be at around 2,000 farmers and around 200 communities. We are now in 2,000 stores in the U.S. We sell our tea boxes. Back here, maybe you guys saw this. And we just launched this bottle beverage, which you've seen a couple people. I'm sorry, the hotel people told me I couldn't keep them in the refrigerator, distribute them. So, but you can have the tea bags. Those are now in 50 stores on the East Coast, in Whole Foods from Boston up to New York, and we're projected this year to hit about $1 million in sales. And we purchase about 1,000 pounds of fresh leaf a day, which converts to about 300 pounds of dry leaf, just to get a sense of fresh leaf.
So I want to just push the page. We talk about impact, investment, social enterprise. Can each of you just characterize how you measure or value impact? How do you envision impact, whether as a business or an investor? Or how do you measure or articulate that? Start with you, Scott.
Yeah, it's a great question because there's lots of different tools and metrics, and people are coming and trying to come up with the secret algorithm.